Have you ever stopped to think who's actually in charge of the world? I mean, when something huge like a pandemic hits or we're all facing climate change, those problems don't care about borders, right? So who makes the rules? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. We're going to dive into this super complex, kind of messy system we call global governance that, tries to keep our world running. All right, so here's the game plan for today. First, we'll tackle the big puzzle of global governance itself. Then we're going to meet the major players on the world's political stage. After that, we'll follow the money and look at the economic rulemakers. We'll also get into the real question: who really holds the power? And to wrap it all up, we'll size up this whole system, because it's imperfect for sure, but maybe, just maybe, it's also essential. Okay, let's kick things off with the most basic question of all. Why do we even need all these global institutions in the first place? Well, it really boils down to one single fundamental challenge. I mean, just think about it for a second. Our entire world is basically a collection of independent countries, right? No single country has a boss telling it what to do. But, and this is a big but, our biggest problems, things like trade wars or terrorism, they just don't play by those rules. They don't stop at the border. And that creates this massive tension, this constant push and pull between a country's right to do its own thing and the fact that we all have to work together to solve these huge shared problems. Okay, so right off the bat, let's get one thing super clear. When we talk about this stuff, we are not talking about a world government. Some single, all-powerful authority that bosses every country around. That's pure science fiction. What we're actually talking about is global governance. It's a totally different beast. It's more like a complicated web of institutions where countries agree to cooperate. The key word there is agree. It's all about persuasion and negotiation, not force. All right, so now that we've got the basic concept down, let's meet the heavy hitters. Who are the key players on the world's political stage? And of course, you have to start with the big one, the United Nations. This organization was literally born from the ashes of World War II. Its entire reason for being, its one primary goal, was to make sure a global catastrophe like that could never, ever happen again. And the UN's mission is, well, it's huge. I mean, with pretty much every single country on Earth as a member, it's the one place where everybody can get in a room and talk. They talk about everything: peace, security, human rights, humanitarian aid, you name it. And they do this through key bodies like the General Assembly and the really powerful Security Council. And this right here really gets to the heart of the UN's great paradox, its biggest challenge. See, in the General Assembly, every single country gets one vote. That's a really powerful symbol of equality, right? But here's the catch. The resolutions they pass aren't legally binding. So the UN has a ton of moral authority, what you might call soft power. But when it comes down to it, it often doesn't have the teeth to actually enforce its will. Okay, now let's pivot to a completely different kind of organization: NATO. This group wasn't created for talking and global dialogue. No, it was built for one thing: collective defense. The core principle is incredibly simple and powerful. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all members. And if you look at this timeline, you can see how NATO has had to completely reinvent itself over the years. It started out with a very clear mission: to be a military shield against the Soviet Union. But then, boom, the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and suddenly NATO has to ask itself, what are we for now? It had a real identity crisis. And then came 9/11. That's when Article 5, that attack on one is an attack on all clause, was triggered for the very first time. It was a defining moment that proved NATO could adapt to a whole new world of threats. Okay, so we've met the big political players. Now it's time to follow the money. Let's turn our attention to their incredibly powerful counterparts, the institutions that basically write the rulebook for the entire global economy. You'll notice a pattern here. Just like the UN, the world's major economic players were also born out of the chaos of World War II. It all happened at a famous conference in a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World leaders got together and created two giants: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. And the goal was crystal clear: to build a stable economic system so that the kind of financial collapse that led to so much extremism and conflict in the 1930s could never happen again. Now, a lot of people get these two mixed up, but they have totally different jobs. The easiest way to think about it is this. The IMF is like the world's financial firefighter. When a country's economy is on fire, the IMF rushes in with short-term loans to put out the flames and stabilize everything. The World Bank, on the other hand, is more like a long-term construction crew. It's an investor, funding massive projects, things like new roads, schools, power plants, all with the goal of helping countries build their economies and reduce poverty over the long haul. All right, and that brings us to the third major economic player, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. So, if the IMF and World Bank are kind of like the bankers and investors, the WTO is the referee. Its job is to set the rules for global trade, and this is super important to settle disputes when countries start accusing each other of cheating. And a classic example of this in action is the never-ending battle between the US and the European Union over subsidies for their giant airplane makers, Boeing and Airbus. We're talking about a conflict involving billions and billions of dollars in claims of unfair advantages. This is exactly the kind of high-stakes fight the WTO was created to referee, stepping in to make a ruling and, hopefully, stop a small dispute from blowing up into a full-scale trade war. Okay, so we've got all these powerful institutions setting the rules for politics and the economy, but that leads us to the million-dollar question, right? Who actually has the most influence? Who's really writing the rules? This table right here, this is where things get really interesting. This pulls back the curtain on how power works at the IMF. See, unlike the UN General Assembly, it's not one country, one vote. Not even close. At the IMF, it's simple. Money equals power. The more money a country puts in, the more votes it gets. And just look at these numbers. The United States has a massive 16.5% of the vote. To put that in perspective, that's more than Japan and China put together. Now, this system was set up after World War II to reflect who had the biggest economies back then. But today, well, as you can imagine, it's a major source of debate and criticism. And this quote from one of the sources we looked at really hammers this point home. It says, "This is the IMF's number one weakness. This is that the IMF is dominated by the US. As the largest economy, it contributes the largest quota and enjoys nearly 17%, a difficult motion to vote down." Basically, critics argue this gives the US an enormous amount of leverage to shape global economic policy, and it makes it really hard for anyone else to challenge that. Now, if we hop back over to the UN, the ultimate power play isn't about voting shares. It's about one single word: veto. In the UN's most powerful group, the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members: the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. And any one of them, any single one, can kill a major resolution just by saying no. It's an incredible amount of power. And as you can see from this chart, that veto is used very strategically, usually to protect a country's own interests or to shield its allies from criticism. So after looking at all these different pieces, the politics, the economics, the power plays, how do we make sense of it all? Let's take a step back and try to see the big picture. You know, if you wanted one perfect symbol for this entire system of global governance, you could probably point to the International Court of Justice. It represents this really beautiful, noble idea that everyone, even powerful countries, should be subject to the rule of law. But, and it's a huge but, the court has no army. It has no police force. It can make a ruling, but it has absolutely no power to enforce it. It relies entirely on countries choosing to comply. And that really brings us to the bottom line. Global governance is not some clean, efficient machine. It's messy. It's a constant, grinding negotiation full of compromises and raw power struggles. But for all of its deep, obvious flaws, it's pretty much the only framework we have for getting countries to cooperate on the big stuff. So in the end, you're left with this kind of balance sheet. On the plus side, it creates a space for countries to talk instead of fight. It sets global norms, and it helps organize action on problems that affect us all. But on the minus side, yeah, it's often painfully slow, it can get tangled up in bureaucracy, and there's no denying it's heavily influenced by the most powerful nations. And so that leaves us with a final and, frankly, a really important question to think about. As the world faces more and more global threats, we're talking bigger, scarier stuff than ever before. Is this rulebook, which was mostly written for the 20th century, still good enough for the challenges of the 21st? That, right there, is the question that's going to define our future.